There exists a quiet assumption carried by most people through their adult years, a belief so embedded in the fabric of daily life that it rarely receives conscious examination. This assumption suggests that childhood represents merely a developmental stage, a temporary condition to be outgrown and surpassed. According to this view, the years of youth serve as preparation for the real business of living, and once maturity arrives, those early experiences fade into background noise. They become stories we tell at gatherings, photographs tucked into albums, or vague emotional impressions that occasionally surface without warning. The prevailing cultural narrative insists that becoming an adult means leaving childish things behind, adopting responsibility, and operating from a place of rational control. Yet this widespread belief contains a fundamental error, one that Carl Jung spent decades of clinical work uncovering. What Jung discovered through his therapeutic practice contradicts this comfortable notion entirely. Within the psyche of every adult, regardless of age or accomplishment, lives a child. This is not a poetic metaphor or a sentimental way of describing nostalgia. It is a genuine psychological entity, an active force that operates continuously within the architecture of the unconscious mind. Jung identified this presence as an archetype, one of the foundational patterns that shape human experience across cultures and generations. This inner child possesses agency. It influences the thoughts that arise unbidden, the emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to their triggers, the decisions that sabotage carefully laid plans, and the relationship dynamics that repeat themselves despite conscious efforts to change them. Far from being a passive remnant of the past, this archetypal child functions as a living energy within the adult psyche, shaping identity in ways most people never recognize. The inner child carries within it a paradoxical duality. On one side, it holds the purest qualities of human consciousness. Creativity flows from this source, along with the capacity for wonder, genuine sensitivity to beauty, and the ability to experience life with fresh perception. These are not traits that belong exclusively to youth, but rather essential capacities that remain accessible throughout life when this inner aspect is honored. However, the same archetypal figure also carries the deepest wounds a person can sustain. Experiences of abandonment, rejection, humiliation, and emotional invalidation become embedded in this inner presence. The pain does not remain locked in memory alone. It becomes a structuring force, an invisible hand that guides behavior and perception long after the original events have passed. What happened to the child we once were continues to happen within us, playing out in endless variations until it receives conscious attention. Jung observed through his clinical work that the majority of adult psychological suffering originates from one fundamental error. People learn to repress this inner child rather than acknowledging its existence. Society teaches us early that certain emotions are unacceptable, that vulnerability represents weakness, and that maturity requires leaving sensitivity behind. In response, individuals construct elaborate defenses. They adopt social masks, assume rigid roles, develop rationalizations for their behavior, and sometimes turn to substances or compulsions to keep the child locked away. This strategy appears to work initially. It allows people to function in professional settings, maintain social respectability, and project an image of competence. Yet beneath this constructed surface, a tremendous price is being paid. The cost of this repression manifests in multiple forms. Neurotic patterns emerge that resist logical explanation. Existential crises arrive without apparent cause. Chronic anxiety becomes a constant companion, draining energy and focus. Emotional codependency develops in relationships, creating bonds based on need rather than genuine connection. A persistent sense of emptiness follows people through accomplishments that should bring satisfaction. Perhaps most devastatingly, destructive patterns repeat themselves across years and decades, immune to conscious attempts at change. The same conflicts arise in different relationships. The same self-sabotaging behaviors undermine new opportunities. The same emotional reactions surface in response to familiar triggers. This repetition is not a sign of personal failure or lack of willpower. It represents the inner child attempting to communicate through the only language available to it. The inner child does not simply vanish when ignored. Repression does not eliminate psychological content, but rather displaces it into the unconscious, where it continues to operate with even greater power precisely because it remains unseen. The more this child is denied recognition, the more forcefully it manifests in distorted and destructive ways. Consider the adult who responds to minor criticism with disproportionate rage, as though their entire identity has been attacked. Or the person who feels invisible in relationships, unable to believe that their presence matters despite evidence to the contrary. Or those who compulsively seek validation from authority figures, never feeling secure regardless of how much approval they receive. Or individuals who struggle to establish any boundaries, saying yes when they mean no, tolerating mistreatment rather than risking conflict. These behaviors often get dismissed as immaturity or weakness, yet they are not character flaws in the conventional sense. They represent something far more complex and profound. In these moments, the adult is not truly in control of their responses. Instead, the wounded inner child has taken command, reacting to present circumstances through the lens of past pain. The criticism feels like existential attack because it echoes early experiences of invalidation. Relationships feel threatening because they reactivate memories of abandonment. Authority figures become surrogates for parents whose approval was never secured. Boundaries remain impossible to maintain because setting them once led to rejection or punishment. The person is not choosing these reactions consciously. They are being governed by an aspect of themselves that was never properly seen, understood, or integrated into their adult identity. This dynamic operates beneath the threshold of awareness, which is precisely what makes it so powerful and so resistant to change through conscious effort alone. Here Jung articulated something that challenges conventional approaches to psychological healing. The inner child does not need to be fixed as though it were broken. It does not require correction or improvement. What it needs, fundamentally, is recognition. It needs legitimate space within the adult psyche. It needs to be acknowledged as a real presence with valid needs and genuine pain. This represents a radically different approach from the cultural message that maturity means transcending childhood wounds through strength and willpower. Jung understood that true psychological development does not occur through denial, but through integration. The goal is not to become someone who no longer has an inner child, but rather to develop what he called the internal paternal ego. This refers to the capacity to care for oneself from within, to establish an internal dialogue between the wounded aspect and the protective aspect of the psyche. This internal dialogue marks the beginning of authentic emotional maturity. It means learning not to repress pain, but to listen to it with compassion. It involves building genuine strength rather than merely pretending to be strong. It requires developing an internal presence that can hold space for vulnerability without being overwhelmed by it. When this capacity develops, something fundamental shifts in the structure of consciousness. The person is no longer divided against themselves, with one part trying to suppress another. Instead, they become a unified whole, capable of acknowledging their full range of experience without shame or denial. This integration does not happen automatically with age or through external achievements. It requires conscious work, intentional attention, and a willingness to encounter parts of oneself that have been hidden for decades. Understanding this dynamic is not merely an interesting psychological concept or a therapeutic technique, among many others. It represents a crucial act of psychic survival in a world that increasingly demands disconnection from authentic inner experience. Modern life pushes people toward constant productivity, endless distraction, and surface-level engagement with both others and themselves. In this environment, the inner child becomes more isolated than ever, its needs dismissed as inconvenient, its pain ignored as irrelevant to adult concerns. Yet this denial creates a profound existential crisis. People find themselves exhausted without understanding why, lost despite following all the prescribed paths, and desperately needy in ways they cannot articulate or satisfy. They search for answers in external circumstances, changing jobs, relationships, locations, or lifestyles, hoping that the right combination will finally bring peace. The answer, however, was never located outside. It has always resided within, waiting for attention. This truth is simultaneously simple and almost impossibly difficult to accept. The solution to our deepest struggles does not require more achievement, more control, or more distance from our emotions. It requires the opposite. It demands that we turn toward the part of ourselves that is small, sensitive, and has remained invisible throughout our adult lives. It asks that we finally acknowledge the child who still lives within us, who still feels pain, who still carries wounds that have never healed. This child has been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be seen. And until that recognition occurs, it will continue to influence behavior from the shadows, sabotaging our efforts to build a satisfying life, not out of malice, but simply because it has no other way to make its presence known. The question is not whether this inner child exists. The question is whether we have the courage to look at it directly and begin the work of genuine integration. Jung did not approach the inner child as a singular, uniform phenomenon. His clinical observations revealed something far more nuanced and complex. This archetypal presence takes on multiple expressions within the adult psyche, each with distinct characteristics, needs, and patterns of distortion. These are not rigid categories that people fit into neatly, but rather overlapping psychological patterns that interpenetrate and combine in unique ways for each individual. Understanding these different manifestations becomes essential for anyone seeking to recognize where their most automatic and painful reactions originate. Without this knowledge, people remain mystified by their own behavior, unable to understand why they repeat patterns that cause suffering, or why certain situations trigger responses that seem completely disproportionate to the circumstances. The first and perhaps most commonly encountered expression is what Jung called the wounded child. This aspect carries the explicit and implicit traumas accumulated during the formative years. Abandonment lives here, whether physical or emotional. Rejection takes root in this space, along with experiences of emotional neglect that leave a child feeling fundamentally unseen. Physical violence or symbolic violence both leave their marks, as does the chronic invalidation of feelings that teaches a young person that their inner experience does not matter. This wounded child learned crucial lessons about survival, often very early in life. It discovered that expressing needs led to punishment or indifference. It found that asking for attention resulted in humiliation or further neglect. It experienced that trusting others opened pathways to pain rather than connection. These lessons become deeply embedded, shaping the foundation upon which adult personality is built. When this wounded aspect remains unintegrated, it manifests in adult life through predictable yet devastating patterns. Fear of intimacy develops, creating invisible barriers that prevent genuine closeness even when it is consciously desired. Chronic anxiety becomes a constant companion, a baseline state of nervous system activation that never fully resolves. Codependent relationship patterns emerge, where the person cannot maintain a sense of self apart from their partner, needing constant reassurance and validation. Emotional hypervigilance develops, scanning every interaction for signs of rejection or abandonment. The ability to trust, whether oneself or others, becomes severely compromised. Perhaps most painfully, a persistent sense of emptiness follows the person through life, an inner void that no external achievement, relationship, or acquisition can truly fill. This emptiness is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may accompany it. It represents the absence of secure internal attachment, the missing experience of having been truly seen and valued as a child. The wounded child causes adults to react to criticism as though it represents an existential attack rather than simple feedback. It leads people to perceive rejection where none exists, reading abandonment into neutral circumstances. It drives the repetition of self-abandonment, where individuals recreate in their own behavior the very neglect they experienced from caregivers. This is not conscious self-sabotage. It represents a deep psychological pattern operating beneath awareness, attempting to resolve old wounds through repetition rather than integration. The wounded child remains trapped in the past, continually reliving its original pain in the present moment. The second major expression Jung identified was the eternal child, sometimes called the pure eternus or puella eterna, depending on gender. While the wounded child lives perpetually in past trauma, the eternal child lives in a state of escape from present reality. This is the aspect that refuses to grow up, not out of conscious choice, but from a deep psychological resistance to the demands and limitations of adult existence. It rejects responsibility, viewing commitments as prisons and obligations as unbearable constraints. It seeks constant novelty, moving from one interest, relationship, or project to another without developing depth in any area. Immediate pleasure takes precedence over long-term satisfaction. Admiration is craved, but without willingness to do the sustained work that genuine achievement requires. This aspect carries a visceral, almost physical fear of limits, boundaries, and anything that requires endurance through difficulty or frustration. In adult manifestation, the eternal child appears as chronic procrastination that undermines goals despite genuine desire to achieve them. Relationships remain unstable, ending when they require sustained effort or navigate conflict. Routines feel intolerable, creating chaos in practical life management. The capacity to build something long-term, whether a career, relationship, or creative project, remains underdeveloped. A persistent feeling that being an adult represents a form of imprisonment colors all experience. There may be fantasies of escape, of different lives that would somehow be easier or more fulfilling, without recognition that the pattern would simply repeat in new circumstances. Jung did not view this expression as moral failure or laziness. He understood it as a sign that the vital creative energy of childhood had not found a mature form of expression. The person remains psychologically young not because they are defective, but because they have not successfully navigated the transition to adult responsibility, while maintaining connection to their authentic self. The third expression stands in stark contrast to the previous two. Jung called this the divine child, representing the deepest creative, spiritual, and intuitive potential within the human being. This is the aspect that still believes in the mystery and magic of existence, that experiences life as fundamentally sacred and full of infinite possibility. It is the wellspring of genuine insight, a source of compassion that arises naturally rather than through moral effort, and the root of our capacity to experience wonder and awe. When this aspect remains accessible, it provides connection to meaning that transcends personal concerns. It allows for creative expression that feels channeled rather than manufactured. It enables spiritual experience that is direct and unmediated by dogma or belief systems. Yet paradoxically, this most precious aspect often becomes the most inaccessible. The pain carried by the wounded child and the defensive avoidance of the eternal child together create conditions where the divine child withdraws completely. It becomes buried beneath layers of protection and pain, unable to emerge into consciousness. When this happens, the adult loses connection to their own creative vitality, their sense of purpose, and their capacity to experience life as meaningful. They may function effectively in practical terms while feeling fundamentally disconnected from any deeper significance. The world becomes flat, routine, emptied of the numinous quality that the divine child perceives naturally. This loss often goes unrecognized because the person has nothing to compare it to, having lost access so long ago that they no longer remember what is missing. Jung believed that most people live predominantly under the dominion of the wounded child. They move through the world in a state of emotional lack and psychological survival, reacting from old pain rather than responding to present reality. In romantic relationships, they unconsciously seek the parents they never had, attempting to secure from partners the unconditional love that was absent in childhood. When criticism arrives, they experience it as personal rejection that confirms their deepest fears about their own worthlessness. Patterns repeat with uncanny precision, the same conflicts arising in different relationships, the same disappointments occurring in new jobs, the same sense of being misunderstood following them from one social context to another. This repetition is not coincidence or bad luck. It represents a powerful archetype operating without conscious awareness, structuring experience according to its own logic. Recognizing these three faces requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands a particular kind of self-observation, a willingness to catch oneself in moments of reaction and ask which aspect is currently in control. Is this fear coming from present circumstances or from the wounded child who learned long ago that vulnerability leads to pain? Is this resistance to commitment arising from genuine discernment or from the eternal child who fears being trapped? Is this sense of meaninglessness reflecting actual circumstances or the burial of the divine child beneath layers of protection? These questions open pathways to genuine self-knowledge, creating space between automatic reaction and conscious response. They allow the adult to begin reclaiming authority over their own psychic life rather than being governed by unconscious forces. Yet even as these different aspects operate within us, another layer of complexity emerges. From very early in life, we receive powerful messages about which parts of ourselves are acceptable and which must be hidden. We learn that certain emotions are unwelcome, that feeling too intensely marks us as weak or difficult. Crying gets dismissed as ugly or manipulative. Depending on others becomes shameful, something to outgrow as quickly as possible. Being sensitive gets framed as a flaw rather than a capacity. These lessons accumulate, forming what becomes an emotional education based fundamentally on repression and the symbolic punishment of authentic expression. We discover which versions of ourselves receive approval and which bring rejection. And gradually, we begin constructing masks. These masks represent socially acceptable versions of the self, carefully designed to please others, to function within social systems, and most importantly, to avoid the pain of rejection. We create personas that hide the vulnerable child beneath layers of performance and pretense. The mask of the responsible adult emerges, the person who always takes care of others, who can be relied upon completely, who never asks for help or admits to struggling. Beneath this mask often lives a wounded child who learned that they only deserve love when they are useful, when they are serving others, when they are indispensable. The moment they stop performing this role, they fear abandonment will follow. Another common mask is that of strength and invulnerability. This person needs no one, cries never, solves everything independently, and projects an image of complete self-sufficiency. But this mask protects a child who is forced to grow up too quickly, who learned that showing need brought punishment or exploitation, who discovered that survival required cutting off access to vulnerability entirely. Then there is the mask of success and achievement, the person who constantly performs, impresses, and accomplishes. They may genuinely succeed by external measures, yet beneath the achievements lives an exhausted child still trying to prove their worth to parents who never truly saw them, who never offered the unconditional recognition that would have allowed the child to rest. These masks develop as unconscious strategies to ensure emotional safety in a world that punished our authentic vulnerability. They represent creative adaptations to difficult circumstances, ways of protecting what was most tender and essential in ourselves. The problem is not that we develop these defenses, but that they eventually become prisons. They create vast distance between who we authentically are and who we show to the world. This gap generates a particular kind of suffering, a sense of fraudulence, of living a life that belongs to someone else. The greater this distance grows, the more intense the emptiness becomes. We try to fill this void through consumption, accumulating possessions or experiences. We pursue distraction, staying busy enough that we never have to feel what lies beneath. We seek relationships that numb us rather than awaken us, or we turn to superficial forms of spirituality that offer comfort without requiring real transformation. Yet none of these strategies replace the fundamental psychic truth. The inner child does not disappear with the passage of time. It does not fade because we ignore it or become less relevant as we age. It waits. It waits with infinite patience to be recognized, heard, and embraced. And while this recognition remains absent, it continues to make its presence known in the only way available to it. It sabotages our efforts, not from malice or destructive intent, but because sabotage is the only language it knows to capture our attention, a job that inexplicably falls apart, the relationship that self-destructs just as it deepens, the health crisis that forces us to stop and pay attention. These are not random misfortunes, but communications from the disowned parts of ourselves, desperate attempts to be finally seen and integrated into conscious awareness. If the inner child remains a living force within us, actively shaping behavior and experience, then a crucial question emerges. How can we coexist with this presence without being perpetually dominated by its wounds, its fears, and its desperate needs? Jung's answer to this question is both profound and remarkably practical. The solution is not to repress the child further, to strengthen our defenses, or to finally succeed in leaving it behind. Instead, the path forward requires developing within ourselves an adult presence that knows how to care for this wounded aspect. Jung called this the internal paternal ego, a term that points toward a psychic function capable of serving as internal parents. This presence can embrace, protect, and offer what the wounded child never received from the external world during its actual childhood. This concept challenges common assumptions about emotional maturity. Most people understand maturity as a process of leaving childish needs behind, becoming independent and self-sufficient to the point where vulnerability no longer exists. Yet Jung proposed something radically different. True maturity is not about abandoning the inner child, but about establishing a conscious relationship with it. This requires developing a capacity that remains underdeveloped in most adults. It demands what might be called conscious self-welcoming, an ability to turn toward oneself with the same quality of attention and care that an ideal parent would offer a sensitive child. The internal paternal ego represents this capacity, this ability to become an observer and caretaker of one's own inner life. This internal figure functions by noticing when the wounded child has taken control of consciousness and behavior. Rather than reacting impulsively from that wounded place, or attempting to suppress the feelings through force of will, the paternal ego establishes an internal dialogue. It speaks silently to the child within. I see your pain. I understand why you are afraid. I am here with you. I will not abandon you. These simple internal statements, when offered with genuine presence, create a revolutionary shift in the psychic structure. They introduce a new element into what has been an automatic pattern of reaction. They create space between stimulus and response, allowing for conscious choice rather than compulsive repetition. Consider a common situation that triggers the wounded child. Someone offers criticism of your work, your appearance, or your behavior. Immediately, a disproportionate reaction arises. Perhaps it is rage, a fury that seems far too intense for the situation. Perhaps it is crushing sadness, a sense that you have been fundamentally rejected and found worthless. Or perhaps it is the urge to withdraw completely, to isolate yourself from all contact, to disappear from the relationship or situation entirely. In the past, you might have simply acted on this reaction, said things in anger that damaged the relationship, collapsed into depression for days, or cut off contact without explanation. Or perhaps you tried to suppress the reaction through sheer willpower, forcing yourself to appear unaffected while the pain festered beneath the surface. The paternal ego offers a third option. It recognizes in the moment of reaction that what is occurring is not actually about the present situation. The criticism from this person, in this context, has activated something much older and deeper. It has touched the wounded child who carries memories of invalidation, of being told repeatedly that they were not good enough, smart enough, lovable enough. The pain being felt is not proportionate to present circumstances, because it is not really about those circumstances. It is the child reliving an ancient wound, experiencing in this moment all the accumulated pain of similar experiences from the past. When the paternal ego recognizes this, the entire dynamic changes. You move from a reactive state to an active caregiving stance. You are no longer identified completely with the wounded child. Instead, you become the adult who can hold space for that childish pain while not being overwhelmed by it. This is the core of genuine psychological maturity. It is not about becoming emotionally cold, distant, or indifferent. That would simply be another form of dissociation, another mask. True maturity means developing an internal presence that can contain difficult emotions without either suppressing them or being controlled by them. It requires being simultaneously the child who feels and the adult who cares. This integration transforms a fragmented psyche into one that functions as a coherent whole. But this capacity does not develop through insight alone. Reading about the concept, understanding it intellectually, even having therapeutic conversations about it, all of this helps. Yet none of it replaces the actual practice of learning to care for oneself as a genuinely good parent would care for a sensitive child. This brings us to what has come to be called reparenting, the active process of offering the inner child what was never provided during actual childhood. Many people believe that time heals wounds, that simply growing older, becoming independent, and gaining emotional autonomy will naturally resolve childhood pain. Yet the truth proves far more challenging. Time heals nothing that continues to be ignored. The wounds of the inner child remain open and active, not merely in memory, but in the body's stress responses, in the patterns that govern relationships, in the automatic reactions that arise before conscious thought, and in the cycles that repeat across generations. These wounds require something more than time. They require conscious attention, deliberate care, and a willingness to become for yourself the adult you needed when you were actually young. Reparenting does not mean dwelling endlessly in the past, reliving traumas in endless repetition, or remaining stuck in grievance about what was not provided. It means building, in the present moment, a real relationship with the most sensitive and wounded parts of your psyche. It involves doing for this inner aspect what your original caregivers, due to their own limitations, ignorance, or unresolved trauma, could not do. This includes offering emotional validation, the simple but profound acknowledgement that what you felt and feel makes sense. It includes creating internal safety, a sense that you will not abandon yourself even when circumstances become difficult. It requires establishing clear boundaries, protecting yourself from people and situations that cause harm. And perhaps most fundamentally, it means giving yourself permission to exist exactly as you are, without needing to perform, achieve, or transform yourself to deserve basic care and recognition. The process begins with a particular quality of listening. Not intellectual listening that tries to understand pain through analysis and logic. Not the listening that immediately jumps to solutions or tries to fix what is broken, but emotional listening, a quality of attention that simply embraces what arises without attempting to change it, suppress it, or reason it away. The inner child does not want to be fixed as though it were a malfunctioning machine. It wants to be recognized as real, as valid, as worthy of attention. It wants to know that its pain is not madness or weakness. It wants assurance that its need for love was not excessive or shameful, but perfectly natural and legitimate. The reprinted adult is not someone who has become invulnerable to pain, but rather someone who has learned to handle their own vulnerability without self-betrayal, without turning against themselves in moments of struggle. Reprinting also involves establishing internal boundaries, a practice that proves difficult for many people. Often the inner child continues seeking from others what the conscious adult has not learned to provide. It looks for protection in relationships that are actually dysfunctional or harmful. It seeks validation through social media, measuring worth by numbers of likes and followers. It pursues love in situations where diminishing oneself becomes the price of acceptance. Learning to recognize and refuse these impulses is not a rejection of the inner child, but an act of protection. It is saying internally, you no longer need to beg for love from people who cannot truly see you. You no longer need to make yourself small to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. I am here. I take care of you now. You are safe. Another fundamental aspect of this process is developing the capacity for emotional self-regulation. This means learning to calm yourself when anxiety arises, to offer yourself presence in moments of crisis, to comfort yourself without resorting to compulsive behaviors or escape mechanisms. These practices may seem simple, yet they carry tremendous power. Stopping to breathe consciously when panic begins to rise. Writing to yourself in a journal as though speaking to a frightened child who needs reassurance. Choosing to remove yourself from toxic environments even when it causes short-term difficulty or social judgment. Each of these actions sends a message to the unconscious, a communication that gradually rebuilds trust between the adult self and the wounded child. The message is consistent and clear. I will not abandon you anymore. I will not betray you by staying in situations that harm us. I will not ignore your distress or pretend everything is fine when it is not. Over time, something begins to shift at a level deeper than conscious thought. The wounded child, which has been screaming for attention through sabotage and symptom, begins to quiet. Not because it has been suppressed, but because it is finally being heard. The intensity and frequency of impulsive reactions decreases because now there is an adult genuinely present, maintaining conscious awareness rather than being swept away by every emotional wave. Relationships change in quality because the desperate emptiness that demanded to be filled at any cost begins to heal. The person no longer needs another to complete them or to serve as the parent who will finally make everything right. They have become that parent for themselves. The energy that was previously trapped in defensive patterns and compulsive repetitions begins to circulate freely through the psyche. And with this liberation of energy comes the return of capacities that may have been dormant for decades. Creativity re-emerges, not as something that must be forced, but as natural expression. Genuine sensitivity returns without the overwhelming vulnerability that made it feel dangerous. The authentic desire to live and engage with existence replaces the exhausted sense of merely surviving. This is the essence of true healing, not the erasure of the past, which is impossible, but the creation of a present moment where old pain finally finds acceptance and integration. Reprinting oneself constitutes a revolutionary act in a culture that demands we simply get over our wounds, that we move on without looking back, that we remain productive and functional, regardless of what we carry. It is an assertion that the story does not end where it was interrupted, that new possibilities exist not to rewrite what actually happened, but to radically transform how those experiences live within us today. The past cannot be changed, but our relationship to the past can be fundamentally restructured through this work. Yet something even more profound occurs when this wounded aspect stops being carried as a burden and begins to be recognized as a guide. When the child feels safe, when it knows it will not be abandoned again, when it trusts that there is finally an adult present who will protect it, a transformation takes place. The pain that manifested as chronic anxiety, emotional addictions, destructive relationship patterns, and an insatiable inner void begins to dissolve. What emerges from this process is not merely relief from symptoms. What emerges is power. Not aggressive, dominating power, but the quiet strength that comes from being whole, from no longer fighting against oneself, from the integration of previously exiled parts of the self. When this child is recognized as an essential aspect of being, rather than a problem to be solved, it stops acting from the shadows. It no longer needs to sabotage life to get attention. It does not need to scream internally every time someone rejects, criticizes, or ignores you. Because now it knows something it has never known before. It is not alone. There is an adult there, present, protective, available. An adult who has learned to love not because it was taught by others, but because they chose not to repeat the abandonment. And at this threshold, something almost miraculous happens. Pain transforms into creativity. Lack gives way to genuine connection with others. Anxiety shifts into presence, the ability to be fully here rather than trapped in past or future. When the inner child feels genuinely safe, it reveals its highest expression, the divine child that Jung understood as the carrier of wholeness. This aspect is not afraid to feel deeply, to create without self-consciousness, to explore existence with wonder, to be enchanted by life itself. It holds within it the deepest meaning available to human consciousness. Jung taught that the child is ultimately a symbol of wholeness, of the integrated self. When this integration occurs, the person stops living in fragments, divided between public persona and private shadow, split between what is shown to the world and what suffers in hidden silence. The warfare between different aspects of self finally ceases. True freedom begins precisely here, in this moment of integration, when you no longer need to fight against yourself, when masks become unnecessary because you have stopped betraying your own truth to gain approval, when you no longer shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for you, when you become the very home, the sanctuary, the safe harbor that you have always sought in other people, other places, other circumstances. This represents the turning point that all genuine transformation moves toward, and it does not arrive from outside. No course, no relationship, no achievement, no external validation can provide it. It comes only from the radical gesture of looking inward with courage and speaking these words to the child who has waited so long. I see you. I am here for you. I will not abandon you anymore. This is not the end of the journey, but the true beginning. The beginning of a life that is more whole, more authentic, more aligned with what is real. A life in which survival is no longer the goal. A life in which you can finally, truly live.